All right, well, welcome back from lunch. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. Special thanks to our sponsors who provided us with food, as well as all the great prizes and giveaways, and the vendor and all the venue and all of that stuff as well. So our first talk after launch is Will Schroeder, also one of the core developers of the Veil project, also phone installer, and some other an awesome PowerShell script that does some awesome stuff with Recon. I know all the stuff he's working on, but I won't talk about it because I think he's about to. So with that, here's Will Schroeder.
Cool. So this talk is Adventures in Asymmetric Warfare, Fighting the AV Vendors. I'll kind of go over a little bit more what this talk's going to be about, but at a really high level, it's kind of walking through the thought process we had in developing some of the obfuscation and evasion methods in the Veil evasion project. So I'm Will Schroeder. I go by the handle Harmjoy. I'm a security researcher and red teamer for the Adaptive Threat Division of Paris Group. Also, one of my coworkers and co-Veil developer, Chris Spencer, is here. He presented this morning. But our company is based out of Northern Virginia. We do cool pen testing, red teaming. We get to do security research and stuff like that. It's a lot of fun. If anyone needs a job, you can talk to me after. I'm a co-founder and co-developer of the Veil framework. So our main site is veilframework.com. We presented it's been out for about a year and a half, but the big kind of public release was on ShmooCon this year, a talk called AV Evasion with Veil Framework. I also released a second tool, kind of in the toolkit, called Veil Village, which is a modular post-exploitation framework. Presented that at DEF CON this year, Veil Village Post-Exploitation 2.0. So I co-wrote Veil Evasion with Chris. I wrote a payload delivery tool called Veil Catapult. I wrote a PowerShell situational awareness tool called Veil PowerView. Wrote Veil Pillage. Wrote a PowerShell script called PowerUp, which automates Windows privilege escalation. And I'm an active 4-time PowerShell hacker. So, pretty kind of short TLDR, but I'm going to go over a little bit through the problem space and how difficult AV detection is. I'm going to go over kind of how the project started, its initial motivations, kind of how it came about. Chris also covered some of this stuff in a little more detail in his talk this morning. I'm going to go through several of our approaches, kind of the evolution of our thought process in doing the obfuscation. I'm going to really kind of dive into detail about the obfuscation methods and kind of increasing level of sophistication. And this is going to also result in the release of an entirely new payload language, which is in the development tree right now, and it's going to be version on 15. And I'm going to wrap up with some really kind of short basic static analysis of some of the payload families. So the whole team problem. This is it's a little like computer science theory kind of stuff. But in general, if you have a sorry, let me back up. The whole team problem is a way. I'm doing a terrible job explaining this, so I'm just going to go on. But essentially, if you have the input of a potentially malicious program, and if you had a generalized problem statement where the output is true if that input program would cause a host computer to be compromised, and false otherwise, you can build this nice little halting proof that reduces everything down to this universal halting problem we're trying to come up with. Now, after all that nonsense, this is basically what it means. Antivirus detection is an undecidable problem. That means it's provably impossible to design a 100% effective antivirus solution. So even though it's technically impossible to do this, you can make reasonable approximations. But my point here is that detection is very, very, very hard. It's easy for us to kind of throw up our approaches and say, ha ha ha, we got around these multi-million-dollar corporations. But their task is a nearly insurmountable problem, and it's pretty much almost an impossible task. So our problem, though, is virus total. So a few years ago, people started noticing that the stock stagers for meterpreters started getting caught by antivirus solutions. As Chris mentioned, really the big problem is antivirus vendors caught up to pen testing toolsets because they're open source, but they're still doing a poor job of catching professional malware. This was taken about a year ago or so. I think this was in the ShmooCon presentation. I forget what the detection rate is now, but this is a stock interpreter stager generated by NSFM. So again, antivirus started snarking out more and more of the stock NSF payloads. We started researching kind of really basic ways to keep doing our job. And the problem here is, if we're on a 5-day pen test that includes setup and tear down time and everything like that, you don't want to burn an entire day trying to roll up a bypass method to get around something. Again, all of our initial efforts drew from prior work. Thank you, Mark. I'll call him out here in a second too. But we don't claim to have been into any of this stuff. We have a little bit of initial or kind of original research that we've been developing and releasing, which I'll go over. But everything that started was just drawing from public sources. We wanted to take it and kind of weaponize and automate it in a way where we could just roll stuff up really easily on Kali and have something pop out without having to do, like a second Windows platform with installations and drop everything in and like do all that kind of stuff. So previous work, Mark actually had a post for tips for evading antivirus during pen testing. This is the first public resource to talk about using Python to inject shellcode. Like Chris had mentioned this morning, we were thinking, okay, kind of stepping away from that lower level assembly obfuscation kind of thing, if we're using Python where people can wrap it up in PyInstaller, which legitimate projects do, then maybe we can use some of these Python scripts to inject shellcode, get our stators going, in a way that kind of, utilizes PyInstaller as kind of a, like a packer, like a lot of malware has. We end up mostly drawing from Devashish Mandel's execute shellcode using Python. This uses a little bit different approach than Mark's. This is, they both utilize C types, which is a Python foreign function interface. The idea here is it lets you utilize some of the lower level Windows API functions. Now, this is this one on the bottom is execute shellcode using Python. It was the first time I really kind of saw detailed this virtual alloc pattern, where you use virtual alloc to create a rewrite execute memory page. You copy all your shellcode in to that rewritable executable memory page. You create a thread with that, and you wait for that thread to complete execution. So this is a standard pattern. Any language or approach that you can have access to the lower level Windows API, you can use this pattern to inject shellcode or build an interpreter stager, which I'll talk about later. In our solution, we wanted a way to get around antivirus as easily as professional malware. We don't want to have to roll up on backdoor every time. We don't want to have multiple environments. We want a single monolithic attack platform. The code base was written by myself, Chris Punser, and one of our coworkers called Monty Shiv. And the whole idea with the Veil framework, or Veil Evasion, is we wanted a way to generate payloads in a language and technique agnostic way. So again, it's kind of like drag and drop. There's like folders divided by language and approach. You can write your own private stuff and just drop it in. It'll load up into the tree, and you can utilize all the compilation stuff, all the common libraries and things like that we have. We also have on our site, veilframework.com, we have like tutorials on writing your own modules, integrating Veil Evasion with your own tool sets, all that kind of stuff. And again, there was a ShmooCon presentation this year, AV Evasion with the Veil framework. I think the video is online, the slides are online. So if you want a little more information, kind of on a little bit lower level components of the framework itself, then you can check that stuff out. This is a screenshot of the Veil Evasion interface. You see all the the payloads that are loaded. This is actually 2.13. This is in the dev tree now. It's going to be released or merged into master on the 15th. And we have, like all of our common interface and stuff like that. So real quick, a couple things and kind of the ethical issues in the release of this project. The disclosure debate is not anything new. We've been talking about for over a decade now the exploit disclosure debate and all these types of things. I initially didn't want to release the project or some of the code bases until we had a lot of long, drawn-out arguments saying, like, okay, what are the ethics? Is this okay to release this kind of offensive toolset? And the consensus we came to was like, yes, because pen testers are over 5 years behind the professional malware community. This is a problem that the bad guys have already solved. AV is not a problem for them. It's especially not a problem for any, like APT or more advanced targeted type attackers. So if we want to simulate these types of threats and provide value to a client, then we felt like having a toolset like this is a legitimate kind of component of your arsenal. This is some of the, I love this slide. These are some of the quotes from the public reaction on the Reddit thread. Let's see. Surely this will just result in 21 new signatures for all major AVs and we're back to square one. Isn't our entire field meant to be working towards increasing security rather than handing out fully functioning weapons? But I really like this quote here at the bottom saying, the point here is that anything that helps to expose how ineffective AD really is in stopping even a minimally sophisticated attacker is a good thing. This is Chris Campbell's actually, he's a security tech, he's going to be talking in the blue team room after this talk. I put this quote in every single presentation I have now because I think it's funny. But he just said today, he's like, it's true, having to do all the stuff by hand. I remember having to do it by hand. It was terrible. You would have to have like your Windows environments dropping everything in. It was just a giant pain. And then I love the response from Script Junkie saying, back in my day, we'd obfuscate bits by hand up the whole focus. So kind of the initial steps we took. We started with Python-based shellcode injection techniques, and we kind of started branching into other languages, which I'll talk about. One of the first things we realized was that similar payloads are going to be a really easy way for you to get caught by AD, or really easy just to write a static signature. Something like, a straight pre-compiled Python shellcode injector where, it injects shellcode through command line or something. It's great, it's really effective, but you can write, you just MD5 it. You can just write really easily an exact static signature for it. So we wanted a way to try to randomize and obfuscate everything so it at least, didn't have the same MD5 every time. So the very first kind of pass at some of this obfuscation was, again, let's randomize everything we can. This works better than you think it would, better than it should. We substitute in random strings for all variable names, shuffle up everything, in the straight Python script, try to have it be different every time. So this is, I know it's kind of small, but this is like what a typical Python payload would look like now in Validation. This is what was produced. So, it just kind of looks like garbage. I realized actually just this past week, I posted to my GitHub some of the original unobfuscated stagers because I realized that people wanted to kind of look at it and see how they worked. This isn't commented, like I don't know what the heck. I know what this is doing because I wrote it, I guess, but like it's hard to particularly understand this stuff. So kind of the next step that we took was we were playing around with some of the encryption mechanisms and things like that to obfuscate. Like, what if vendors still find a way to trigger on the actual malicious Python script sources? So, real quick, if you don't exactly know how PyInstaller works, it basically wraps up a self-contained Python environment, takes your script as a resource, like sticks it in there, and then when you run it, it extracts everything you just temporarily and invokes that script. Like, okay, let's see how far we can take obfuscating a Python script file. So we introduced a little kind of module called Hyperion, which is like a Python encryptor inspired by Hyperion. It encrypts an entire Python file with a random AES key. It's randomized each time. It base 64s it and rolls everything up into a nice little exec wrapper. So every time this is run, even for the same exact input file, it'll generate a completely different blob of text, and I'll show you here in a second. So this is what one of the shellcode injectors look like first. You still have some of the binary data and all that kind of stuff. Like, okay, is there something more we can do with this? And after Hyperion, this is what it looks like each time. You just have a couple imports, a little exec, and like a giant blob of text that changes every single time because the keys change every time. So like, okay, we figured that's about as far as we can go with Python obfuscation. One of the next things we kind of started, our thought process started going down was, what if vendors were triggering on the raw shellcode and the actual decoders, whether in C or in Python? Like, okay, then what if we just eliminated the shellcode altogether and build some pure interpreter stagers? What these basically are is that logic from shellcode that you get from MSF Venom. You take that logic and you can translate it to a higher level language, and you get a interpreter stager that does not rely on shellcode generated by the framework. They actually aren't that complicated. Raphael Mudge has some great posts down here. He open sourced a Metasploit loader, and he has a blog post about what stage payloads the contesters should know, where he goes into detail kind of explaining this stuff. So real quick, this is how the stager works. You open up the TCP connection back to your Metasploit handler, Metasploit handler. The handler spits back 4 raw bytes that indicate the size of the DLL. This is the interpreter DLL itself. This is actually what's running in memory of the machine after you pop it. Spits that back, then it spits back the full actual interpreter DLL. This, on the client side, the socket number that it connected back, that's pushed into EDI, and the reason it does this is so you don't have to open up a separate control channel back. It can just use that existing socket. So it pushes that into EDI so the interpreter can actually pop that out. Execution is past the DLL, just like you would with regular shellcode, either using void pointer casting or that virtual alloc pattern I talked about. And then the interpreter uses that existing socket connection, starts its SSL negotiation and all that, and then it just goes down. So we started writing a bunch of these stagers in different languages. We have Python, interpreter, versus TCP, HTTP, and HTTPS. These are actually easier than the TCP stager, where all you do is connect to an HTTP handler. You download a giant blob, which is either reflectively injectable DLL or shellcode, and then you just jump execution to it. So we also have stuff in C. We have a reverse TCP service, which will work with PSExec, HTTP and HTTP service, which will work with PSExec as well. We have C#, we've got the same TCP, HTTP, HTTPS. PowerShell, we released this, I think it was around the DEF CON timeframe, released a couple of these peer stagers. And Ruby, which I'll talk about here in a minute. So that was really super basic stuff. It was still reasonably effective in a lot of these cases. But for things like C, just basic variable obfuscation isn't going to work that well. We started thinking, okay, C specifically, because it's a lot easier for AD engines to detect some of the code in it, can we introduce something a little bit more interesting? So our slightly kind of more, I'm using advanced with air quotes because it's not that advanced. But our C obfuscation involves our interpretation of what we were calling a method knob. And basically, the idea here is, how can you muck up dynamic analysis without affecting the execution of the program? That means nested call functions, like randomized stuff, a whole bunch of processing. And the idea is that we thought our approach was throw in enough string processing functions that sufficiently complicate the call tree of the program. This is a very basic version of what malware has been doing for years. It's not that, shouldn't be that effective, but it is really, really effective. You just have all these processing stuff, the CPU will actually spike just a little bit. So for us, specifically for C, what we do is we choose a whole set of randomized string processing functions, reverse, split, all that kind of stuff. We malloc a huge several thousand strings of randomized lengths, and then in throughout the code, we'll intersperse these different nested processing functions all throughout it. This happens in several places. So, maybe the virtual page is allocated, and after that, there's several nested. You should look at an IDA or something, and it just explodes. So this is really, really effective for a lot of the C stagers. And again, those we have versions of those stagers which will work with stock PSExec. This is just kind of showing you string generation functions. This is probably a terrible screenshot, but all this stuff is randomized out. If you actually look at the C payload modules, you'll see everything that's thrown into there. Cool. One of the next things we were thinking was, okay, what does vendors trigger on the PyInstaller loader itself? And again, that the exact way how PyInstaller works is it has this little exe loader that then it attaches basically kind of like a zip archive at the end of it. And that little loader runs, it extracts the zip archive from itself, extracts that to disk, invokes the interpreter and all that kind of stuff. So you're like, okay, and the reason this actually came about is because that little loader actually enables, or has def enabled whenever you try to run it. So Chris and I were investigating how can we get def disabled for these payloads. Because if you want to do something like the void pointer casting, that will fail if the region of memory is not executable. So as we were investigating this, and we put a post out, I think, in January about how to recompile this stuff, we're like, okay, if we can recompile this on one of those, maybe we can get it recompiled in Kali. That took a little effort with enabling, but we figured out how to recompile the PyInstaller, or the PyInstaller loader every time in Kali. Like, okay, if we're doing that, why not obfuscate the source as much as we can? So this past spring, I gave a talk at BSides Boston called Installer 1.0. This is basically it uses the randomization stuff as well as all the string processing method call nesting stuff that I just talked about. It puts all that into the PyInstaller source, and then every time you run this, if you choose the option for PyInstaller and veil evasion, it'll generate a obfuscated, unique PyInstaller loader every single time you generate a payload. We integrated this into veil evasion this past May. It's also a standalone tool that's right up there. So, again, in each round, obfuscated code for every single source file associated with PyInstaller is generated. min-gw32 is used to compile everything up to a new runw this little loader, exe, all straight on Kali. You don't have to drop this to Windows. Everything's transparent. You don't have to configure anything. The run W is copied into the correct location. Now, randomized Windows icon is chosen for the final package result. There's a blog post I have on Phone Installer, and also I think the video and the slides for the BSidesAugusta presentation are out if you're interested. So this is kind of like the big thing, I guess, that I'm really seeing at this on our presentation. But since some people started paying attention to the PyInstaller binaries, let's try some other languages. We already, we first branched into C with some good obfuscation. C#, you can actually use mono on Kali to compile .NET executables that'll run on Windows. PowerShell, you start mentioning that, is awesome. You can have no disk writes. And Ruby, which I had, so I apologize if there's prior stuff out there about this, but I really couldn't find much. Ruby has a foreign function interface, just like Python. It's a gem called Win32 API. So this means, because we have access to those lower level functions, we can inject shellcode, and we can write native pure interpreter stagers all in Ruby. And Ruby has its own PyInstaller analog, a gem called Opera, one-click Ruby application. There's the Opera.Ruby port. So I was trying to think like, okay, can we get this all running on Kali? Because again, our philosophy is we want to have a single monolithic attack platform. You don't have to switch back and forth. This is showing the Ruby shellcode injection. You can set up all your virtual alloc, move memory, create thread. You have your shellcode here, and it's pretty easy. Just virtual alloc, a memory page, move all that memory there, create the thread, wait for the object to complete, basically wait forever. And this entire thing will inject whatever shellcode you want, all in Ruby. And we have it running on Kali for Opera. So the new setup will download all the gems you need. Everything will be set up for availability when you update. Then when you compile a Ruby payload, which I need to push into the dev tree today, it'll run Opera all in the background. You see it's compiling everything up. It compresses everything, and it builds out your little exe right here. So all this Ruby stuff, it's pretty much the exact analog of PyInstaller with the approaches we have. But now we're going to be releasing the Ruby shellcode inject and Ruby interpreter stager. Again, they're in the dev branch. Will be merged in the master on our V-Day for this year, which is actually our 1-year anniversary. Everything is compiled with self-extracting Windows executable. The last kind of cool little thing releasing is so because C# and VB.NET code is compiled, it's not interpreted, so you can't build the kind of little dynamic obfuscator like you can for in a scriptable language like Python or Ruby. But .NET has a really interesting little feature called reflection, which is, this is taken from the Windows documentation stuff. So you can use reflection to create type instances at runtime and then invoke and access them. What this means is, if you have a byte array of just raw bytes that are read in .NET executable, you can run the entire executable in memory without touching disk using just 3 lines. You create little assembly A equals load, and you load up whatever your byte array is. You set the entry point, you create that object, and you basically say, start running this. The cool thing is, you can obfuscate these bytes in any way you want beforehand. You can base64 them up, you can encrypt them, you can download them from a secondary location. And then you can, this is essentially kind of like doing that, like the reflective DLL type injection idea, but it's significantly easier using .NET. So we're releasing a small, kind of simple .NET crypter called Area. It's a crypter for all .NET binaries. It was pushed along with the Ruby payloads. It's also a standalone if you want to use that. So a normal payload binary, either VB or C# or whatever, is generated. It's compiled as normal, and if you set the crypter to run, it will read in all the raw bytes, will base64 encode it, and builds a random substitution cipher, so it's not just straight base64. And then it builds like a little launcher or dropper. There's 2 options. You can either have it launch that obfuscated version from memory, or you can host it, and then it'll build like a little web dropper. It'll go out, download it, and then pull it down and execute it on memory without touching disk. And again, this is all just using reflection. This is kind of what it looks like. You have some a little bit of just the standard logic. This is actually a full .NET binary that's all in memory. It can be any .NET binary you want. So it's pretty simple. The really cool thing is, which I'll go over here just a little bit, is it changes completely every single time you run it. So it really messes up kind of that .NET CIL compiled stuff inside of it. Cool. I'm going to finish up by going over a little bit of analysis of some of the payload families. So SSDeep is a fuzzy hashing static malware comparison tool. And this is also called context-triggered piecewise hashes. And it allows for the comparison of different malware families. From its documentation, it says it can match inputs that have homologies. And this is just a fancy biology term, which is basically a way of saying, how can you measure the shared ancestry of two different bits of information? So it kind of breaks everything. Instead of doing a hash of an entire file, it'll like break it down in like little ones, and then kind of do a binary matching between two files of saying how much of this code base is related between these two binaries. So what I did was, for about 3 or 4 of the failed evasion payload families, I generated 1,000 samples of each one, and I did runs of SSD over all of them. And what it did was, it basically matched up pairs. It did 1,000 choose 2. So it basically did every single pair combination of all the payload modules. So say for like Python interpreter versus TCP, 1,000 choose 2, so 499,500 possible pairing combinations. Of these for Python, 169,107, or about 1/3, matched a score of 75 or better, and only 66 of them matched a score of 90 out of 100 or better for the matching stats. And from one of my kind of blue team reversing friends, he said the general rule of thumb, at least in his group, is if something matches at 90 or better on this, it's kind of considered a related malware family with a common ancestry. So what's cool with this is already for just even Python, only 0.01% of the samples scored as a similar malware family, at least from kind of a really basic static analysis standpoint. Showing you kind of the graph here, this is the distribution. I didn't put in all the zeros because that would have spiked the graph up. So a bunch of them are really not similar, but you know, a chunk kind of are. You see a peak around kind of this matching point. You see it really kind of trail off. So we get really chunky randomization. You know, these payloads are different every single time. For C, this is one of the pure C interpreter stages. You get the same 499,500 possible pairings, 267,387, so about half, matched at a score of 25 or better. So that means half had absolutely like no match at all. They were completely different. And only 0.5% scored at 90 or better. And the average pairwise score was 37. What was the average for that? Yeah, forgot to mention, the average score for Python was 74. So you see here that even though we have a few more, it's 0.5% instead of 0.01%, a few more that are kind of in that similar malware family, we have really good wide variation in a lot of the generation. So it's kind of all over the map. Again, there's a whole bunch kind of spiked up here for 0. But it's not quite as tight of a cluster, so even though you get a little more variation kind of at the top end, this is, you know, like really good spread for this type of generation. This is my favorite. So C#, using it's a shellcode inject module. It's using flat injection, using that little area .NET crypter. Out of all those pairings, only 5 pairings of the 499,500 samples, 0.001% match at a score of 25 or better. So these are almost completely different every single time. Because that stuff randomized, generated, there's a substitution cipher. This means that none of the samples scored as a similar malware family. The variation was all over the map. This stuff really different every time. So this is actually the one like I like using now, or I will be using a lot more now, because if you get one of these samples, if it gets caught and submit it up, this is a really hard thing to write a static signature for. And I think I went kind of fast, but so recap, we started out our research kind of out of necessity, but we continue out of curiosity. You know, messing up these AV vendors really isn't that difficult. This stuff is still really, really effective over a year and a half out. Like the Python stuff is still extremely effective even without the own installer. All our code is open source. AV vendors can see what we're doing. They're still not able to write a perfect signature for it. So we did get a McAfee signature a few months ago. It was actually like Trojan Veil. We put that in our blog post about a month or 2 ago on kind of, you know, a year in the Veil framework. So we were really happy with our own little stag signature. But what we kind of take from that is that we're at least, you know, catching the attention of some of these vendors, saying like, this stuff isn't hard. If you're doing proper behavioral analysis and detecting, you know, like that shellcode injection pattern or something like that, that's what we need to move towards. These static signature detection really is dead. There's still ways to stop us. We're not going to go over all those because, you know, that's not our job. And again, our hashtag ADLOL. Cool. Questions? I can either take them now or hit me up on Twitter. Email me. There's more information about the Veil framework on our Veil framework site. In the goods, this is the Veil framework project. We have a master project that's Veil. If you pull it down, we'll pull down all the components of the Veil framework, install everything up. We're actually probably going to be rewriting the framework from scratch in the next couple of months. It's going to be Veil 3.0. We're hoping for a winter or an early spring release. Those unobfuscated stagers I mentioned, I just pushed those to my personal GitHub this past week. So if you actually are curious on how each of these work or how interpreter loader works, HTTPS or something like that, you can download that stuff. It's fully commented and it's not completely obfuscated. So, cool. A little early, but yeah. Questions? Oh yeah, sorry, I've got giveaways too for people that want to ask questions. So, yes.
Do you have any plausible explanation for the gap between malware authors and pen testers?
Yes. So, sorry. A lot of shops have. Sorry. Okay. The question was, can you explain the gap between malware authors and pen testers? And the thing is, like, so a lot of pen testers, a lot of people had techniques like this. Just no one wanted to like burn them by doing them publicly. Like, we're not the first ones to do some kind of framework that does AV evasion. People have had that before. People just didn't want to be stupid enough to expose all those methods open source to where AV vendors can actually detect what they're doing. Our point of this is beyond just wanting to do our jobs. We want to actually try to push in our own little way for the detection for AV engines. But I think the explanation of one, they don't open source their methods, and two, there's a lot more money in professional malware than there is in pen testing. So they have a lot of really smart people that only sit there and can figure that stuff out and get paid a lot more.
I can create these obfuscated payloads as executables. How can I deliver them via memory corruption attacks and things like that within the existing frameworks and exploitation tools that are out there?
As far as memory corruption, for memory corruption, you're just going to use straight normal like shellcode, right, instead of a buffer. Like for this, for us, it's almost more of a post-exploitation kind of thing, or if you need to PSSX to a box, or deliver a payload like this through phishing or something like that. Yes, in the back.
Are there any AV vendors that are doing it right? Already said.
Are there any AV vendors that are doing it right? For detection, yes. Kaspersky, which is basically a Russian botnet. It's like a rootkit, essentially, in their OS. And they send all your samples back to a bunch of servers in Russia. They're really effective. I wouldn't recommend using them because I don't like all my information potentially going back to Russia without them telling me what they're doing. Semantic endpoint protection is also really effective. One of the things they started doing was, if you configure it correctly, is they have this kind of, and there's not like a universal exclude folder across the entire enterprise, which never happens. Some places have started kind of like crowdsourcing the reputation of executables. What they'll do is, they'll say like, oh, I've never seen this exe before. So if you have any encrypted exe, any hack-generated exe, it's going to be brand new. So if they've never seen it before, they'll pop up a little splash screen to the user saying, this is unknown. They won't say good or bad. They'll just say, we don't know what this is. Do you want to run this? With that splash screen stuff, that can potentially mess up some of your delivery mechanisms. So that's really effective. If you want to get around that, you can use PowerShell. Or we actually have a method with Python to where it'll extract a kind of known script Python environment to disk. But all those, you can just kind of do that manually with the zip instead of through PyInstaller. And all those EXEs and the DLLs are known. They're like known good. It's just Python. And then you can invoke like Python shellcode injections to the command line, kind of like you would with PowerShell, and that will get around some of the reputation stuff. So there's almost always going to be kind of a way around, but some of the vendors have started to up the game just a little bit. Yes, in the red.
Are there any plans to write this in any other languages like Go?
Are there any other plans to write in any other languages like Go? Yeah, we're always expanding. We have a large amount of private research and stuff that's already written. And we're just kind of slowly releasing it out. We didn't want to release it all at once. We're also still kind of researching and developing it, but we wanted to space it all out so we're not just dropping 50 things at once. We want to kind of incrementally push stuff forward. But yeah, there's plans for plenty of other languages. If people have ideas, and if you want to submit something, we'd be happy to have a pull request. The one thing that gets tricky is what we're trying to stay away from is stuff where you just generate it and have to compile it on another platform. Not saying we won't ever, not do that, but we really like if you can compile everything on Kali, which makes it difficult. It took a while to figure out how to get Opera, Win32 API gem and everything installed underlying on Kali with all the dependencies, and we have to patch stuff in. It's a little bit of a messy install process, and that's also why there's 800 megs of dependencies or something. Because if you want to compile .NET or VB on Kali, there's only one option that's mono, which is 600 megs of dependencies. So we've had people yell at us for the size of the framework install, but there's not really any other option if you still want to be able to do this stuff. Cool. Isn't it great?
Is there a book that I can have for asking this question right now?
There's nothing more. Okay, no questions. Sorry, I had books. Anything else? Any other questions? Cool. All right. If you want to talk to me offline or after, just hit me up. I'll be out there. So,
What thought for you?
All right, thanks. So we got about
24 minutes. 24 minutes, and we'll start up again on with our next speaker.